Welcome to Praise Hands, home of the Praise Hands, where we are all about creative, cross-cultural Christianity. I'm your host, Robbie Valderrama. Here on this podcast, we examine the American intersection of church, race, music, and economics, and we're thrilled to have you on this journey with us. To learn more about Praise Hands, visit praisehands.com or follow us on Instagram at @PraiseHandsOfficial. Let's jump on into the show. All right, I'm here today with Ricky Ortiz from Meta Church in the Upper East Side in Manhattan in New York City. What's up, Ricky?
Hey, what's up, Robbie? Great to be here with you guys. Thanks for having me on. And typical day in New York, so I'm doing good. Life is good.
Awesome. So, tell us a little bit about the journey that got you where you are today.
Yeah, man. I guess I should start with asking a question first, like how much time do I have? Because it's like, when you start really kind of thinking through all the details of a journey, it really is fascinating. But, the short bit of it, this is home for me. Like I was born in the Bronx. I always had, extended family here, first generation. Like this is where my parents came over to. So New York City has always had, even as a kid, teenager, when we moved away, had a fondness in my heart and something that I always loved. And so I would say, really the journey started my kind of like the first week of my freshman year of college. I went to a ministry college and knew that God wanted me in some sort of like vocational ministry, but I wasn't really sure what that meant or what that would look like. And within that first week, the Holy Spirit really started speaking and revealed to me that one day he would send me back to New York City to start a church. And, probably like most of us, I guess like the journey, you think that in that moment, okay, well, this will happen like as soon as I graduate and that'll be it. And so you're just like ready, like, okay, boom, that solves that.
Right.
But, honestly, the journey has been, I was in college in Jacksonville, Florida. That's where I ended up meeting my wife. He took us from there once we graduated to a suburb of Portland, Oregon. And we were there for 5 years where we were serving a part of church plant Reboot. And then from there, we moved here to Manhattan. We're a part of a church here, like a multi-site church in the city. And we were there for like just under 2 years, and then took us from, ultra populated, fast-paced, hectic, crazy New York City to a church, like a mega church in South Carolina that was based in like a rural farm town and, total opposite. And then we were there for about 2.5 years before finally he released us to come back to start Meta Church in 2017. And so the journey has kind of been like literally cross-country, cross-cultural, cross-context, from suburban to urban to rural to back to urban. But along the way, I think that's what makes the journey so special, is that you pick up these tools and experiences and skills and a revelation of like what your giftings are, that are going to be necessary. That's, looking back now, I can see all those stops and all those, parts along the journey for preparation for what he wants to do and what he's called us to do in the here and now. So yeah, that's kind of, that whole thing. And I think one of the things that's always was always a challenge was trying to maintain a proper perspective on that, to be fully engaged in the moment in 2007, when I know one day I'm supposed to be in New York City, but that one day isn't that day. And so how do I serve and lead and love and engage and be present where I'm at in the moment without getting ahead of myself or trying to shortcut the process?
Right. Those wilderness or those waiting seasons can be challenging and defining and stretching. But like you said, a lot of times God uses those seasons to grow us into the person we need to be for the future seasons.
Right. And even like with my wife, she had to go on her journey as well. She's from Seattle, like where people are super nice. They're really friendly. Here, they're not nice. They're not friendly. And so he was just kind of allowing for her to, to reconcile that. Like, this is what you're calling as well. And so there's all those pieces, man, that like, you just don't want to miss out on, or you just don't want to lose by trying to rush the process. So yeah, that's a little bit of like the journey, kind of a snapshot, but it's been filled with like ups and downs, marriage troubles, ministry challenges, learning things, failures, successes,
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to being in ministry, and whether that's ministry in a vocational sense or in the marketplace, you got to know your why. You got to know what you're doing and be really clear about the values that you have. So that way, when things get rough, you're not blindsided.
Right.
And I would love to chat about what you guys are doing at your church a little bit. One of the values that is listed on your website as your core values is that you are disturbed.
Yeah.
Why is being disturbed a core value of your church?
Yeah. It's a great, it's a great word. It's a word we don't typically want to be associated with. And when we, traditionally when we say like, oh, that person's disturbed, like it's almost kind of like a negative connotation. But for us, kind of zooming out a little bit, like we really believe if you change New York City, you change the world. And that's kind of like our motto, our mantra, our mission. It's like all of that, like change the city, change the world. I guess on one hand, it implies and suggests that there's some things that need to be changed. And, we're unwilling to change those things unless those things actually truly bother us or disturb us to action.
Yeah.
We could say, oh, like we're bothered or we're annoyed but like disturbed kind of like, speaks to this conviction that like, man, deep down, something is not right here. And I'm compelled to do something about it. As far as like a DNA, as far as like a value and identity piece, it was huge. Cause it's like, I think about like, my own marriage, and when things kind of started to fall apart, at some point I had to kind of like bottom out and just say, you know what, I don't care what's going on. I've got to be different. Who I was or who I've been up to this point is no longer acceptable. And it disturbs me so much that I'm going to alter course and determine to do something or be something different. And so, with our church, like that's kind of the same thing. It's like meta is the Greek word for change. And so, our name, like it's not just something that sounds cool or is catchy. And I think it does both of those things, but the substance is the change. And so we have to look at the world around us and say, and we write this on our site too, but it's not just the world around us, it's like the world within us. Like who are we becoming? What are we doing? And we have to be disturbed within ourselves and then commit to that change and then be disturbed with what's around us before we can affect change in the lives of others that we're connected to.
Yeah, that's really good. One of the reasons I wanted to ask about that is on this show, one of the things that we talk about is looking at the systems around us. And people can fall into maybe one of two camps where some people are aware of the need for personal transformation and personal change, but maybe blind to the systemic problems that are out there. And then on the flip side, you have some people that are really aware of the systems of injustice that are around, but fail to transmute or to follow that logical train all the way back to themselves. And so I love the connection between what's going on around and what's going on within us, because ultimately those are connected.
Yeah, 100%. Like they're fully integrated,
right?
Because the world we live in is a product of who we allow ourselves to be in our best and worst moments. And you can't disconnect them.
Right.
Like we're really quick to like point blame at others, but if you start within yourself, you realize you're just as susceptible to contributing to that system, in a harmful way.
Right. One of the quotes that you've listed as one of your favorites is from an anti-institutional Catholic social reformer named Ivan Illich. And I love the quote you provided. It says, if you want to change a society, then you have to tell an alternative story.
Yes.
So given your value of being disturbed by what's going on around you, what is the story that you see most people believing that they're in? And how does that differ from the story that you're sharing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, on this quote, I think there's a couple of things real quick that I'll speak to. One is he says you have to tell an alternative story. And I find that fascinating because he doesn't say you have to tell a better story. I think there's two parts to that. One is an alternative is that most people, it implies or suggests that most people don't really understand or see or not even aware that there is an alternative story. And they're just kind of stuck in the belief that this is the way things are, this is the way things have to be. Now there's a pro in that the story you tell, like sometimes just the revelation of, whoa, there's another option, can compel someone to live a better story. But there's also the harm in that it doesn't necessitate it being an objectively better story.
Sure.
You see that, right? Like in the likes of politics or like throughout history, the clearer the story, the more rallying around that or whatever. So a lot of people don't understand, like there is another option, there is another path, and it's not just another path, but it's a better path. And I would like real kind of nuts and bolts. Like, if I use kind of this reality that like in New York City, we're a lot of times kind of jaded, angry, skeptical, and really quick to like disrespect or belittle someone that we don't even know. Like, I mean, they accidentally bumped us on a subway and we're quick to like flip out and like yell and curse or whatever.
Yeah.
That's the real story. But an alternative story is that no one feels good about themselves when they do that. Or very few people feel good about themselves doing that. So what if, like, when that happened, you tried a different approach, you would actually feel better about that. You would actually feel better about yourself and that. And they're like, wait, is that true? I didn't know that was an option. Let me pursue that option. And when I experienced that, it's like, oh yeah, this is a better way. And so like that is what changes a society. It almost seems overly simple, but in a city like this, it's a very legitimate thing that we talk about and discuss. But with it, what we've tried to be really intentional about is not just saying, hey, Jesus is the solution and Jesus is the answer, like which we believe, but it's really kind of tying it to the self-interest of a person. How is Jesus the solution for what I want in my life, or what I want out of my family, or what I want out of my career? And kind of speaking to that, Jesus really has a better way that actually increases or makes what you're pursuing or what you desire something that's more substantive than just kind of like these basic instructions of like, well, I'm supposed to make a bunch of money because that's the story I've been told. And it's like, well, what if that money you make is a catalyst for empowering and dignifying other people who don't have those opportunities, who don't have the means to get to where you've been? And it's like, oh, okay, now there's an alternative story here for what I wanted out of life. And potentially that could be a better story or something that frees me up to make a difference or feel better about who I am and who I'm becoming.
Yeah, that's really good. Here at Praise Hands, we're all about creative, cross-cultural Christianity. And one of the reasons why we believe so strongly in the need to be cross-cultural is that we learn from each other from different backgrounds, whether it's socioeconomically, racially, in many different ways. And one of the things that stands out to me about your church, you mentioned that where your church meets is intentionally in a socioeconomically diverse neighborhood. Obviously, it's going to be a racially and ethnically diverse neighborhood because it's New York City, but particularly socioeconomically diverse with how Manhattan is laid out. Right, there's the different blocks. Right, you want to tell us a little bit about that and why you chose to be located there, and maybe even some unique challenges and opportunities that's created for you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're listening or watching, you're not really familiar exactly with kind of the layout. If you were to look at a map of Manhattan, we're Upper East Side, which means basically to the right of Central Park. And then the streets kind of ascend to the north. So we're on 89th Street. Our church meets on 99th Street. And traditionally, the break is at like 96th Street. And then north of 96th Street is East Harlem or Spanish Harlem. And I joke, like, you know, if you're over like 30 or over like 35, beneath 96 is like where the Jeffersons wanted to move on up to. Like, you know, they were trying to get from like the northern part of Harlem, like down to the Upper East Side because of like that idea that this is where the haves live or the haves dwell. So 96 has traditionally been kind of like that breaking point. And part of the reason for that is because 96 is a cross street that runs all the way from the east side to the west side through Central Park. And there's only like a handful of those, 96th Street, 86th Street, 66th Street. So really there's three. So it just kind of becomes a natural border or dividing line. Where our church meets or where we're located is on 99th Street. And yeah, the reason for that was kind of a really clear understanding for us. When we lived here the first time in 2013, 2014, we lived right in this neighborhood. And there was a very clear kind of divide or division between those two neighborhoods. Yet the irony or kind of like the challenge in this is like where, you know, like the Upper East Side, like half a mile from where I'm currently sitting in my apartment is the most densely populated neighborhood in the U.S. You know, if you go half a mile in any direction, and there are over 86,000 people that live like within a half mile of my apartment. And so you have this super highly densely populated area. There's a major subway line that has over 1 million riders a day on just this one line, not the entire subway, but just this one line of the New York City subway system. And so it's, you know, clearly there's a lot of people who are here and trying to get to here. But then traditionally there's kind of this case or separation of like the haves and the have-nots. So we wanted to kind of bridge that gap as best as possible. So when we began looking for like a meeting location, we knew we didn't want to be beneath 86th Street, which is kind of another one of those traditional divides because of a cross street. Because if we were beneath 86th Street, the people kind of in East Harlem, Spanish Harlem would feel like, yeah, that's not really my people, or they don't really get me, or they don't really know where I'm at. And then we also know we didn't really want to go above 106th Street, which is, you know, too far into East Harlem for the people on the Upper East Side to feel like, oh, that's, I'll use the word safe, but not like in a dangerous way, like safe in a, this is familiar. You know, it's a totally different neighborhood, distinct characteristics, traditions, cultures. So it's just not like familiar in that way. So we wanted to kind of position ourselves as close as possible where people from both ends of the spectrum could attend or show up and feel like, yeah, this is home. This is familiar. This is like, I see people like me and I see people who aren't like me, but we're all here in this kind of shared space. So yeah, it was a really intentional process and kind of journey of trying to secure a space in this kind of like 10 block parameter.
Yeah. So one of the guests we had on recently is a worship leader named KJ Scriven. And he talked about differentiating between making decisions sociologically versus theologically. Obviously, it'd be easy to look at a decision like that and say, oh, practically it makes sense. Are there theological reasons why you felt that was important to the mission of your church as well?
Yeah, because I think, and that's a great distinction, I think the theological part of it was that because God is a God for all people, and it's hard to convey that message and to help people believe that message and internalize that when we could easily start 2 locations in this same stretch of neighborhood. But, you know, in doing so, what you're doing is kind of like God's a God for all people, but those people go over there and these people go over here. And so, you know, because of these divides, we wanted to really be intentional about helping reveal and demonstrate a God who bridges those divides and says, yeah, like, you may feel like you're on the lower end of the economic totem pole and this person might be on here, but that doesn't mean you can't have fellowship. That doesn't mean you can't have genuine love and community. That doesn't mean you can't have genuine friendship. And so it was very much an intentional decision. And I think that's also what you see in the way of Jesus. And evangelicalism is kind of portrayed sometimes that Jesus was like always like with the outcast and the marginalized, which is true. But what is also true, the wife of the financier for Herod was one of Jesus's greatest financial supporters. So Jesus was bridging the gap between, you know, the socioeconomic spectrum as well and connecting in a way where people on either side felt like, yeah, this is not just what I want to be a part of, but this is a person I want to commit to and follow, and I can find fellowship and harmony across those gaps.
Right.
So it's very much like an intentional, strategic, and then also theological positioning.
Yeah, even if you look at the nativity story, you've got the shepherds and you've got the wise men. And you've got that bridge even from the very beginning.
Oh, 100%, right? You know, like how much money would you have to travel for X amount of time to arrive and then offer like wealthy gifts, you know, and still have some left over to give versus I was just sleeping out here in a field with some sheep and followed a star to this place.
Yeah, I love that you guys are chasing after that. And speaking of your neighborhoods and your community, in particular, you guys do some interesting things to measure the growth of obviously your people, but also the impact that you're having in your community. You wanna talk to us about that?
Right. So we have like the traditional gauges, right? Like, you know, of course, attendance, of course, like weekly offering type stuff, of course, like people serving or people connected through like our church's small groups. And so hopefully no one listening is like hearing me say, oh, throw those things out, you know, that's old school or whatever. Like there's still some merit to those things, at least in our church, in our community. Those aren't the only metrics or the only gauges that we want to tie ourselves to. And so with that, the things that we try to gauge are also a little bit more difficult to keep track. You can't just kind of like throw them on a dashboard and then pull up a website that has like X amount of this. So we try to tie these things back to our 5 DNA and disturb that we talked about earlier. That's one of those DNA. So we say we're like disturbed, we're tenacious, we're present, we hold nothing back, and we live to love. So we have these 5 identity pieces, kind of like thumbprints. And so with that, because those are a little bit harder to gauge externally, we focus on like our inputs versus like the output or versus the outcome. And what we mean by that is that, you know, when we're talking about being disturbed, we can control how much we emphasize why that matters and what change and what transformation is possible when someone embraces that and embodies that in their lives. We'll be really intentional about not just speaking about that, but then giving opportunities for people to essentially identify like what disturbs them and then help them build a path to resolve that or address it. Just again, to get really practical and make it a little less abstract. Like with tenacity or tenacious, you know, for us, we say like, we don't just have the grit to hold on, but we're committed to taking ground and advancing the cause. Our cause is helping people experience the transformative power of Jesus in their lives. And so, you know, we just had a meeting within the last week with our lead team about the people that they're shepherding and responsible for and guiding. We say, hey, like tenacity is about saying, hey, Robbie, what is God speaking to you? How is God shaping you? How is God forming you? Let's talk about this. But tenacity isn't just like asking that question once. Tenacity is being willing to go there, but then also like repeatedly go there and not give up until a person says, you know what, like, yeah, here's what he's speaking. Here's how he's shaping me. Here's how I'm living this out or acting upon this. And so now that we have that understanding, let's just start with two. Who are the two people that each of you are going to begin pursuing in this way over the next 45 days? Well, again, we don't have like hey, send me an email with each thing and we'll keep a running tally or scorecard, but that's an input. And then what we try to do out of that is like just observationally assess, okay, well, what's happening from this 45 days from now? Like who's being impacted, or what are the stories that we're gathering and collecting and telling? And so the things we look at are like, obviously you have like pretty general ones, like what are the social things that are happening? Who's getting together socially?
Because you mentioned you actually measure and celebrate community building that takes place outside of your church.
Right. That has nothing to do with like, hey, this is a church function or this is a church kind of driven initiative.
Yeah.
And so recently we had a group of ladies get together for a fun like party thing or whatever. And they're all like basically in their mid to late 20s. So it's like, wow, that's awesome. And that's happened like several times where they've done that. But then with this particular time, we've had several new women in that demographic, come and be a part of our church community. So the gauge I was looking for, I didn't know this was going on until my wife actually told me about it. Okay, great, that's a win. But now, like, here's a second gauge. Who that is new to our church community has been invited into that social, gathering? Because again, what that communicates to me is that one, as the pastor, I didn't know this was happening, so that's great. Two, I didn't have to say to so-and-so who's leading this, hey, this person is new. Can you ask them to join in so they can feel included?
Right.
And so, that's kind of a big thing that we try to track is like, what are the things that we don't know about? And then we find out about like after the fact or like, via Instagram stories or something.
Right.
The social one is a big piece. Another one that we try to gauge is like how many of our people are actually just out involved in some sort of community service event, project, community gathering that has nothing to do with meta church. And so it could be like, hey, there's some sort of festival at this park or local like street fair or whatever. And so they're involved in hanging out, being there, socializing, whatever. Or, they're involved with some parachurch organization or a nonprofit in the community and they're volunteering there. Those are all types of gauges that we try to like assess and see like this is kind of clicking in people in a personal way without someone telling them this is what you have to do, or here's a corporate way that you can fulfill this one objective.
Right. And I think that's so powerful because what we measure and what we celebrate ultimately becomes our vision. Whether we have a separate vision statement or not, our culture is going to trump the vision. And so we have to be really careful about what we're celebrating and measuring. And oftentimes in church, it can be said that we value what's going on outside the church, but unless we're measuring that, we're really not taking responsibility for it.
Right. Exactly right. If you're not measuring it, and then to your point, like if you're not celebrating it, because then what it feels like is like you're kind of like violating some sort of secret code. Whereas we can celebrate and acknowledge like, hey, so-and-so is involved in this organization and that's awesome. Like that's a huge win for our church. That's a huge win for our city. And that's a huge win for that person's life.
Right.
We have people who come to our church or are part of our church and maybe they don't have the exposure, the opportunity to get into a higher earning job. But we have other people who do have those kind of jobs. And so what's been cool over these couple of years is to see those people in those positions of opportunity and leverage actually extend opportunity to the people who maybe wouldn't have access into that, either by like internships or like, hey, I may not be able to get you this job, but you should apply for it, put me down as a reference, and I can give a good word for you. That kind of stuff is huge. And again, it's all self-initiated. It's not fostered off of, hey, this is what we should be doing to help the needy. It's, I care about you. And because I care about you and I know who you are, I know that you're the type of person that could actually add value to this organization or opportunity. Even if you wouldn't have had consideration apart from me.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And so one of the threads that I'm hearing also, in addition to being socioeconomically diverse, there's also got to be some intergenerational diversity happening in terms of people reaching across that to help each other out.
Right.
And I know one of the big questions that church leaders have been asking for a little while is, quote unquote, how do we reach millennials? Right. And a recent Barna study showed only 40% of millennials are feeling optimistic about the future.
Wow.
And many churches have struggled to address this and many other topics and dynamics facing millennials. So how have you guys at Meta not only managed to get millennials to step foot in your church, but even feel invested in the vision and culture of your church?
It's really interesting because by no means am I an expert. I would say like I'm an observationalist, someone who just kind of observes and forms thoughts based off of my experiences or what I see happening around me. But I mean, to the first part of it, like, how do we get millennials to come to our church? Like, I don't know. You know, and a very honest and transparent way. I think my wife and I just never expected that. I'm 33, you know, we're both 33. And so when millennials just started coming, it was kind of like, oh, this is cool, but people in their 24, 23, 26, but it was not what we expected. And it was all very social and organic. And that, you know, the first couple that started with us was a couple we had a longstanding relationship with. They were 24 maybe at the time. And so then it kind of extended to like their friends. But here's kind of since then, here's what we would always hear is that like, oh, I saw the change in Eric and Brooke's life. And so I thought, well, if that's happening for them, like I want some of that. You know, I think that kind of segues into like this bigger thing where like millennials aren't leaving because Christian community is irrelevant. Millennials are leaving because they don't see what the merit or what the value add is to their life. Like, what is it changing about me? And if the answer is not much or very little, then, well, maybe I'll go look for that change or that transformation somewhere else. And so, you know, because from the beginning, our mission has been about transformation. I think as people have started to experience that and observe that in their friends, they started to say, well, let me see if I can get that for me. Let me see if I can experience that in my life. And then in that kind of same wave, you know, what we've always communicated and conveyed is that like, we can complain about the way things are, but at some point, someone has to decide enough is enough. We need to do something about it. And that's kind of, again, going back to like that disturbed DNA. I read a leadership book years ago that really helped kind of shape this line of thinking. And it was a book by a guy named Jim Kouzes, and he wrote it, you know, probably 30 years ago. And it's like in its 5th edition now. He kind of gives like these 5 premises for leadership in great organizations. Like one of them was this value of inspiring a shared vision. And that word shared is huge because my church experience has been we inspire a vision that the pastor has or that benefits the church's kind of brand, if you will. But it's not a shared vision in the sense that, oh, Robbie can see himself not just being a part and fulfilling their vision, but that by fulfilling that vision, it actually fulfills his personal vision for his life and for his family and for his faith. And so we've tried really hard to do both. We use this imagery a lot, but if you imagine that people from all over the world are coming to New York City and to kind of represent New York City is the Empire State Building, you know, an image of the Empire State Building. They get to the bottom and their hopes, their dreams, their goals is to, you know, get to the top. And then at some point, you know, a lot of them will go back to wherever in the world they're from, wherever in the world they want to be the best at that. Our vision in our heart as a church is to be the elevator that helps get people up to the top and then releases them to do what they're called to do and be who they're called to be. So for us, that's our shared vision, is that we have a vision to change the city and change the world. But we believe part of how we change the city and part of how we change the world is by actually elevating you and lifting you up to fulfill what God has called you to do. Not just, hey, help us have X amount of people so that our Instagram is popping, you know? And so that's a really big piece. And I think for the millennial side of things, it's so compelling because they realize these aren't just words that we're saying. It's very sincere. It's my wife's desire. It's my desire. It's our leadership team's desire. So they see the authenticity and the transparency in that. And it's just created a level of ownership and excitement around what we're doing because they feel like what we're doing also helps them do what they want to do down the road or in the present reality. And then when you think about an outlook on the future, all of a sudden the future is bright. The future is bright because I feel like, one, I can attain or arrive to the future that I've been called to. And along the way, it's not just about like being a passenger. I get to be in the driver's seat and help choreograph what the future needs to look like.
Yeah. And not only for myself, but also be a part of that transformation for others.
Oh, 100%. Right. You know, if you're in the driver's seat, it's, you know, why ride in an empty car? Invite your friends, invite your coworkers, invite your neighbors to jump in backseat, jump in the passenger seat and go with you and experience that change and that transformation as well.
Yeah. You mentioned how important it is to cultivate a culture at your church that's not just about the lead pastor's vision, but it's really about a shared vision. And it's not just about things that are benefiting the church staff or a pastor, but really benefiting everybody. In that vein of things, as a pastor, you've got a source of income apart from tithes.
Right.
How has this lack of dependency on key financial shareholders affected the way that you do ministry? And what advice would you give to church leaders who might feel overly dependent on key givers?
Right. Yeah. That's a really important piece of this whole puzzle for us. One, when we moved back, we knew as a church plant, we weren't going to be able to be financially supported by the church just because of the cost of living in the city. And two, even if we were capable of being financially supported to the fullest extent, essentially what that would do is hamper our ability to do meaningful or effective ministry for others that requires finances and resources. So I'll say right off the bat, like it's not like a bad thing if someone is receiving an income from the church or starting a church or starting a ministry and they're taking an income. I think that's scriptural. I think there's biblical basis for that, you know, and I recognize that even in our own situation, there will be a day where we will be fully dependent upon an income coming from the church or our ministry to support us or whatever. But in the current reality, what it's allowed for us to do is like we were able from the very beginning to really think about how can we leverage the resources that we have for the sake and benefit of others. And I'm not looking at it as, well, if we give XYZ away, or if we invest in this, you know, type of ministry or invest in this community outreach thing or this organization, how do I provide for my family? Or how does my wife, you know, take care of our daughter? How do we live and pay our rent? And, you know, those kind of traditional challenges that come with living off of that. So that's one aspect. But the bigger thing is that like with financial stakeholders and people who are donating, and key in that, it's freed us to just have a very genuine and actual real relationship with someone that's not based on, I got to keep them happy, or the fear, I should say, of keeping someone happy so that we can still receive their donations or their tithes or their offerings. And so with our generous givers, we can just care about their development as a follower of Jesus. We can care about what they're doing, you know, to support their family. We can care about, without this string or like this kind of carrot potentially being dangled either by them or the perception that that's what we have to chase after in order to keep them happy. I have a lot of friends that have started churches. I've been able to kind of work with a lot of church planners. And that's not just true with individuals in their church. That's also true with like church planning networks and other outside funding, where they've got to like, oh, well, I've got to meet a certain metric or someone's going to withhold or pull back the resources that they've invested into the church so far. I understand the idea and the concept and the mechanics of that, but I also think it creates a really dangerous pitfall for the church leaders, the ministry leaders, and the community at large, when that's kind of what you have to strive for in order to maintain. So yeah, for us, it's just given us the freedom to genuinely care about people. We've not had this, but, you know, in a rare situation where someone might threaten to withhold funding or donations, it's really easy to say, that's okay. My wife and I, we literally don't need that. And so if that's the position you want to take, then so be it. We're going to continue to do what God's called us to do with or without those resources, because my rent or my roof over my head isn't dependent upon it.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And I remember hearing a story from a friend of mine. He shared about a major denomination where there was like a regional meeting or whatever. And one of the breakout sessions at their conference was showing church planners how to look up analytics and find out how to identify neighborhoods that they could plant in to have an economically sustainable church. So when you kind of have not only being subject to macroeconomic terms, but also whether it's denominational sources of funding or just things that aren't based in your locale, that aren't rooted in the shared interests and the shared vision, like you said, I think you do have a clash of vision that can happen that doesn't necessarily root in ministry that's what's best for your local community.
Right. It's completely, in most cases, completely unintentional, but it is like chum in the water for Satan and the enemy to kind of take hold of and create that fear, that relationship, that tension between that. It's just easy bait for him to take hold of, because we all care about money. We need it. So, you know, we've had the freedom to not be manipulated by that, either by ourselves or the enemy or another person or an organization. And it's just been really enriching and really freeing for our family. So we've really loved the path that we've been able to take in that area.
Right. To zoom in even more, let's say there's a pastor that's listening to this and they're like, man, I would love to be in that spot. Would you have any like practical next step that they might be able to do to maybe move in more of that direction?
Yeah, 100%. I think one of the challenges that a lot of pastors face, because I've had this conversation a lot with other pastors as well, is like, well, what would I do? And I think because most pastors or a lot of pastors actually have a really broad range of skills that are actually really valuable. And in turn, because they're valuable, can actually generate an income apart from a church community. You know, the irony is if someone gets fired from a church, what you find is that let's say it's a pastor, he gets fired for some reason or loses laid off or whatever, loses his or her job. It's amazing how quickly they find another job that provides an income for them, you know, because all of a sudden you realize, like, what are my skills? I have to identify these things. So I think as a practical next step for a pastor or ministry leader that says, hey, I want to kind of take this step, or I'm curious to know what that looks like. I would say begin by identifying what are the existing skills you have or that you've developed over the course of your ministry. If you're an administrator, then there's obviously tasks and administrative tasks that can be duplicated across other industries or whatever. Let's say you were responsible for overseeing groups at your church, and you had 10 group leaders who then had an assistant group leader, and then they each had like 6 to 10 people in their small group. All of a sudden, now you've got anywhere from 60 to 100 people that you're providing leadership and oversight for in a completely volunteer capacity, or they're volunteers. And so you're having to arrange schedules, administrative tasks. You're raising up leaders to fill those roles as group leaders and assistant group leaders. And so you now have a skill in developing a pipeline of sorts for leadership development, for bringing people up and stepping into roles. Essentially, in vocational ministry, you always have some sort of volunteer ministry that you're responsible for. And so, that's a skill in terms of developing people to learn something new. If you're in the realm of speaking, then you have, assuming, you're decent or whatever. If you have to do public speaking, then that's a skill that you should develop and hone. And so these are all things that you just got to begin with. It's like, what are the skills that I actually have or that I've developed over the time? Let me label them clearly as a skill versus just like, I'm doing sermon prep. Well, that's research, that's R&D, that's research and development, man. You're digging into things, you're studying things, you're learning things. Or music, okay, well, I'm working with a team, I'm choreographing charts, I'm working on production stuff. Those are skills. And so identify what skills you have. And then for me, the venture into the marketplace started with, I had a lot of expertise or experience around helping develop, like in coaching and kind of consulting for like what lended itself to naturally to coaching and consulting. And so I just kind of went to 3 people I knew in different organizations, 2 marketplace organizations, like for-profit businesses, and then 1 in a church, a pastor, and just said, hey, I think I have kind of this framework that I could use for consulting. Would it be okay if I worked with you for like, let's say 3 to 4 months pro bono? I don't need any money. The value I get out of this is being able to say, this works, it doesn't work, let me tinker with this. And so I took the skills that I developed and then kind of just applied them for 3 to 5 months to get real-time results. And then the testimony of that business leader, the testimony of that church leader of, hey, I worked with Ricky and he helped me do X, Y, Z. We went from here to here, point A to point B. That was the value I needed to then be able to go and pitch myself to my first paid job in consulting. So it's identifying the skills you have and then saying, where can I apply these skills? And even being willing to say, let me do this for an extended period of time for no money so that I can really say concrete data that says this works or this could work. And then you just kind of have to take the leap. I guess on a broader sense too, if you're in church, there's people who are in business doing things that are part of your church. So see where those skills could be applied to a different industry and then talk with that person that's in your church or part of your community and say, hey, how could I use this in here? Or is there opportunity? Or if there ever is an opportunity, I'd love to be considered, or I'd love to kind of learn more about it or whatever, and then just kind of take those steps in that way as well.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of opportunities. And I think one of the trends that we've seen for a long time, especially in communities of color, is a lot of bivocational pastors. And I think that as things economically are changing in the future, if we look at artificial intelligence and different things that has the potential to take away jobs, a lot of churches that haven't had to be maybe as creative are going to start having to be more creative because of the economic changes. And I think we can learn from some of the models that have already been developed, such as what you're doing, such as other bivocational models, to really create an atmosphere where people can flourish and have relational health moving forward.
Yeah. And, and like for us on a personal level, about 18 months into leading the church, our church board, our governing board said, hey, we think your family should begin taking an income, even if it's partial, to help kind of carry what you guys are doing. And we declined it. And the reason for that was just because we felt like we didn't need to. We could have easily done that. But again, that's money at whatever percentage or whatever level that could be leveraged for a broader impact or maybe even a deeper impact if I don't jump at the opportunity to just say, okay, well, great, I should get paid. Let me take that money. Sometimes it's just the patience and the wisdom to say, let me stretch this out a little bit longer than needed, this phase or this time period, so that more can be accomplished. And the outcome of that is that, with our church community, the level of respect and trust and equity that's built with our people is invaluable. When that day comes that we start taking an income from the church, those people will be the first ones to go to bat for us because they recognize the process that we've been on, the journey that we've been on, and how intentional we've been about that.
Yeah.
The way we've started things has been really just kind of like, I was hanging out with, he's a pastor in Queens, but he's also on our church board the other day. And he does coaching for the Southern Baptist, like church planners. And he's like, I tell all those guys, here's Ricky Ortiz's contact info, call him, you need to follow what he's doing. But one of the things he said was that, when you told me 3 years ago, this is how you're going to go about it, he's like, that's not going to work. He's like, I didn't tell you that, but in my head, I was like, I don't know, man. And he's like, now he's like, this works. And so, and again, it's not me or Krista, but the way we've gone about it was like the creativity. One of it was the financing and the funding. But then instead of saying, hey, here's our vision, let's just launch really big try to get as many people in. It was, let's, intentionally start small. When we started meeting as a Bible study, we had like 15 people or like maybe 12 people who were like, hey, we want to help you start your church. We started meeting Sunday nights from 9 to 11 in my apartment, made it really inconvenient for people to kind of weed out anyone who was going to be bothered by inconvenience at the beginning. So unconventional, definitely creative, but unconventional to say the least in starting a church. Rather than saying, hey, let's get the biggest number of people possible, we were like, what's our smallest viable audience? What do we need? We really just need like me, my wife, and maybe one other person. And let's start with our smallest viable audience, and then let's kind of build from there. We didn't move into a space. We didn't look for a venue from day one. We said, we're just going to pack out my apartment until we have to move into another space. When we moved into another space, we're like, all right, we're not going to jump into, okay, now we got a space. Let's add worship. Let's add kid ministry. Let's do like, the traditional things that you would think to do. It was no, like, let's wait until we start seeing kind of the fruit of the culture that we're trying to instill before, like, let's focus on identity before we start assigning responsibility. And I think that's kind of a backwards paradigm, in my opinion, of like, hey, give people a bunch of responsibility and then, oh, shoot, later, what's our identity? Who are we? Who are the people, that are leading this thing? So that's kind of been our approach. And I would say it's both creative and unconventional. It's like the nature of the city, the nature of where we meet, the finances, the space, all those things have forced us to really think creatively about how we want to approach these things. But then also the commitment to do it unconventionally. It's the way God has asked us to do it. It's the way we believe God has called us to do it. And it's not necessarily like, oh, God's calling everyone to do it this way. But the willingness to embrace that process and say, let's do this unconventionally. Let's do this in a way that, maybe doesn't seem natural or normal, but in a way that's clearly the way God's called us to do it has been really fruitful. So, I mean, I don't know if any of that resonates or anything kind of sparks, but I'm more than happy to share any of those kind of stories.
Yeah. The way that you approach ministry might not be your typical church in a box sort of way of going about it. How have you guys tried to intentionally develop leaders before you necessarily develop a structure for them to fill?
It's been quite the journey in that way and fun because, we not try to say, here's our 5-year plan. It's like, we're looking at things in 3 to 4 month windows, and then we'll pivot and adjust in 3 to 4 months from now versus, hey, here's an outline of year 1, we need to be here. Year 2, we need to be here. Year 3, those like kind of zooming in and having smaller or shorter kind of mile markers, but the mile markers aren't tied to an outcome. They're tied to like just a positioning. Where are we? And then we'll pivot versus we need to be at X point by this time.
And that's so important. I mean, just how we measure things matter and what we're measuring matters, because the Harvard Business Review just put out an article like 6 months ago or so that basically the gist of the article was all of corporate America in the last, several decades, we've confused our metrics with our results. I know that seems like really nuanced, but we've actually kind of conflated the metrics, right? We're actually trying to receive and what we're actually trying to accomplish. And so many times that can be tough because we're like, kind of to your point about attendance, not that you don't care about it, but it's not, the only thing. A lot of times we can take very simplistic, and a number is not just a number, especially if you look at the racial history and economic history of the country. If we're just measuring numbers, whether that's number of people or number of dollars that are coming in, that's not necessarily an equal way to be measuring the success of our endeavors.
Right. It's so funny and even totally appropriate because I think like every fall in New York City, there's the New York City Marathon. And I think it's like the first weekend of November that it takes place. Well, we have several runners in our church. And so if you're saying, okay, attendance is king, like we have several runners in our church who ran in last year's New York City Marathon. And some of them have run multiple New York City marathons. So they're running in it, but then their families who attend are also going to be out there cheering them on, supporting them. But then their friends who want to cheer them on and support them and go. So all of a sudden, oh, well, if attendance, like what's more valuable, all those people in church on Sunday, or the fact that like all those people say, hey, I believe in this person. I'm going to go out and support this huge milestone for them or this huge moment that they'll cherish for the rest of their lives and be out there with a sign and a cowbell cheering them on. So if you like attendance is this, well, then you'll be like spiteful or upset that all these people quote skip church to cheer on, their friend or their family member and this major event in their life. And so it's like, well, why would I do that? That sounds like even just saying that out loud sounds really petty, but that becomes the spirit of our heart when those kind of metrics become, the result that we say, they become synonymous with the result.
Yeah, absolutely. So many good topics. I love what you guys are doing to be cross-cultural, to be creatively addressing, not coming in with a preset agenda, but really looking at your community with eyes wide open. It reminds me of Jesus when he did different miracles. It said Jesus had compassion and he did X, Y, and Z. And in order to have that compassion, as KJ Scriven also said on one of his episodes, you got to have proximity to the people. And so I love what you guys are doing to see the situation around you and love like Jesus. So thank you for sharing all of that. How can people learn more about what you guys are doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to follow us on Instagram at Meta, META NYC, or follow us online, meta.church, META.church is our URL. You can kind of track along and see what's happening. And there's a lot of things always going on, but we try to be, our social media is really simple. We want to be true to who we are and where we are. So that it gives you, our Instagram will give you the best picture of what's happening in the life of our church and our community. Yeah, I would say those are the two simplest things. Feel free, if you do that, reach out if you want to connect with me personally. I don't know if you want to share like my social media or whatever, but
yeah, we can put all your info in the description for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm more than accessible if people have questions or want to follow up. So, just grateful to be able to share a little bit about our journey and what God's been doing in our lives and in our families' lives and through our church. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, our pleasure.
All right. Appreciate it, Robbie. Thanks a lot.
What's up, guys? Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode of the Praise Hands podcast. If you want to support and follow what we're doing here at Praise Hands, there are a couple ways you can do that. First, if you're on Apple Podcasts, you can leave us a 5-star review. We'd super appreciate it. Second, visit us on Instagram at PraiseHandsOfficial. And lastly, check out our website, praisehands.com. On the website, you can join a volunteer team, become a monthly supporter, or even reach out to us. Especially after today's episode, if you're a church planter or an urban leader, we would love to connect. Visit praisehands.com to learn more. Guys, I'm your host, Robbie Valderrama. We'll see you next week.